When I walked into the restaurant's private dining room, everything was already over. Empty plates, half-finished wine glasses, laughter still hanging in the air. My son didn't stand up. He just glanced at his watch and slid a leather folder toward me. "Dad, you're late. You can take care of this." The whole table burst out laughing. That was when I understood. I hadn't been invited to dinner. I had been invited to pay. I stood there, among people who shared my last name, and realized I had just been turned into a breathing wallet. I smiled, and in that moment, they didn't know that I had just made a decision that would destroy their entire plan. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Harold Bennett, 66 years old, widowed for 7 years, retired from a bridge and highway construction company in Ohio after nearly 40 years of work. I live alone in an old suburban house where every scratch on the wall carries a story tied to Margaret, my wife. Since she passed away, my life has moved slowly, steadily, like a river after flood season. No noise, no surprises. At least that's what I thought. Until that night. The restaurant Evan chose was right in downtown Columbus, a place I had only ever passed by, never stepped into. Bright white signage, floor-to-ceiling glass doors, warm golden lighting reflecting off expensive suits and elegant evening dresses. The kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't list prices, where people speak softly not out of politeness, but because they believe wealth doesn't need to raise its voice. 3 days earlier, Evan had sent me a very short message. "End-of-year family dinner, 7 p.m. Don't be late, Dad." I read that message several times, not because I doubted it, but because I was surprised. Since Margaret died, family dinners like that had slowly faded away, then almost disappeared entirely. Thanksgiving was busy with Melissa's family. Christmas was already planned with her parents. New Year's was traveling to get a change of scenery. I had gotten used to eating dinner alone, turning on the TV just to hear human voices, and going to bed early. So when Evan took the initiative to invite me, I thought about it for a long time before replying. In the end, I agreed. Partly because I missed my son, and partly because I wanted to believe that maybe things were changing. I prepared for that evening more carefully than usual. I wore the gray blazer Margaret bought me for the last Christmas before she passed away. The collar was a little worn, but I couldn't bring myself to replace it. I shaved carefully, combed my hair neatly, even polished the leather shoes that had been sitting untouched in the closet for a long time. Before leaving the house, I stood in front of the mirror for a few extra seconds, looking at a man older than I remembered, but still trying to keep his back straight and his gaze dignified. I arrived at 7:02 p.m. 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. The parking lot near the restaurant was full. I had to circle another block before finding a space, and the parking meter displayed a rate that made me frown slightly. $20 an hour. I almost turned the car around and went home, but then I told myself, it's just one dinner. Family. As the hostess led me past rows of tables draped in crisp white cloth, I heard laughter before I saw them. Not the warm laughter of people happy to see each other again. It was sharp, complete laughter, as if there were no room left for someone arriving late. The private room was at the end of the hallway. As soon as the door opened, the laughter stopped. A long table covered in empty plates, beef bones neatly gathered, lobster shells stacked, wine glasses still holding ripples of deep red. The smell of butter, grilled meat, and expensive wine blended together into a heavy atmosphere I didn't belong to. Evan sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, his napkin neatly folded beside a dessert plate. Melissa sat close to him, phone in hand, long glossy nails flicking quickly across the screen. Her parents, Richard and Paula Monroe, occupied the most prominent seats, sitting upright, their eyes carrying the confidence of people accustomed to being served. No one stood up. Evan looked at me, glanced at his watch, then smiled. Not the smile of a son happy to see his father, but a tired smile with a hint of mockery. "You're late, Dad," he said, using one finger to push the leather folder with the bill toward me. "You can handle this." Melissa let out a soft laugh, sharp and quick. Paula Monroe covered her mouth, laughing as if she were witnessing a refined joke. Richard Monroe took a sip of wine, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, the way someone evaluates an old item brought to the wrong place. The whole table laughed. No one asked what I wanted to eat. No one invited me to sit. No one said, "Hi, Dad." In that moment, I didn't feel angry. What I felt was a cold clarity. Pieces from years past suddenly snapped together, forming a picture I had deliberately refused to see. I hadn't been invited to dinner. I had been invited to pay. I pulled out a chair and sat in the only empty spot, near the wall next to the server's cart. I opened the leather folder. The number made my heart pause slightly. $860-something. For a meal I didn't eat. For an evening I didn't belong to. I placed my card on the bill without saying a word. The server looked at me, a brief flicker of sympathy in his eyes, then quickly masked it with professional reflex. In places like this, people learn not to interfere in other people's family matters. When he returned with the receipt, I signed slowly. Each familiar stroke. Harold Bennett. I had signed that name thousands of times in my life, on contracts, permits, loan papers, but never had my name felt so light. As I folded my wallet, I looked up and caught Melissa's eyes. She wasn't smiling. That look didn't carry the contempt I'd seen in previous encounters. It was sharper, more focused, like the gaze of someone who had just recorded an important data point, as if I had just passed a test and the result had been saved. We held each other's gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she smiled again, the perfect, harmless smile. "Thank you, Dad," Melissa said sweetly. "We're so lucky to have you." I stood up and adjusted my coat. "No problem," I said. My voice was calm enough to surprise even me. No one walked me to the door. Outside, cold wind hit my face as the glass door closed behind me. City lights glared. People moved noisily past. I stood there for a moment, took a deep breath, then headed toward the parking lot. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence fill the car. What replayed in my mind wasn't the laughter at the restaurant, but Melissa's eyes, the eyes of someone measuring, calculating. That night, when I turned off the engine in my driveway, I didn't get out right away. I sat in the dark, looking at the familiar house where Margaret used to wait for me every evening. I suddenly understood that dinner had never been the destination. It was only the first test, and I had just passed it exactly the way they wanted. What they didn't know was that from the moment I signed that receipt, I had stopped playing the role of the trusting old father. I got home just as the kitchen wall clock struck 9:30 p.m. The house sank into its familiar silence, the kind only people who've lived alone long enough know isn't empty, but full of old sounds and memories. I closed the door, locked it carefully out of habit, and stood still for a moment in the dark hallway, my coat still on. Margaret used to complain that I never turned on the lights right away when I came home. She said I always acted like someone afraid of disturbing the darkness. I used to laugh and tell her I just wanted to give the house a few seconds to realize I was back. No one says that to me anymore, but I keep the habit anyway, as a way of telling the house I'm still here. I haven't disappeared. I hung my coat on the wooden hook by the door, the one Margaret had installed herself on a late autumn afternoon years ago. She said it was more convenient there, no need to walk all the way to the bedroom. I ran my hand lightly over the smoothed wood, then walked into the kitchen. The kettle was still in its usual spot. I filled it, turned on the stove, and waited for the familiar sound of boiling. Small routines slowed my thoughts, as if each motion could soothe the dull ache building at the back of my neck. When the water boiled, I made myself a cup of black tea, Margaret's favorite, even though she hadn't been able to drink tea during her last few years because of her stomach. I carried the cup into the living room and sat down in the armchair facing the window. Outside, streetlights cast a pale yellow glow on the bare tree trunks. Winter was approaching. Margaret never liked winter. She always said it made people remember too many things they had lost. I took a sip of tea, but the familiar bitterness no longer comforted me. In my mind, the restaurant dining room replayed clearly. Empty plates, laughter, the leather folder sliding toward me like an object following a predetermined path. I set the cup down and walked toward the small study next to the living room. It had once been Margaret's reading corner. After she passed, I turned it into a place to store paperwork, letters, things I didn't have the courage to throw away. The desk lamp was still in its old spot. I turned it on, pulled out the chair, sat down, and took my phone from my coat pocket. Evan's message was at the top of the list. End-of-year family dinner, 7 p.m. Don't be late, Dad. I stared at that line for a long time. Then, driven by an impulse I couldn't quite name, I scrolled upward to older messages. And there it was, 3 days earlier. Not from Evan. Family dinner Sunday, 6:30 p.m. Mom and Dad made the reservation. See you there. Sender. Melissa, I read it twice. 6:30. Not 7. I clearly remembered seeing Evan's message first and automatically assuming that was the correct time. I had never thought to cross-check, never considered there could be 2 different times for the same dinner. I set the phone down on the desk and clasped my hands together. In the quiet room, my heartbeat suddenly felt uncomfortably loud. If dinner started at 6:30, then my arrival at 7:02 wasn't 2 minutes late. It was more than 30 minutes late. Long enough for them to finish eating. Long enough for everything to be perfectly staged. Long enough for me to walk in and play the role they had prepared. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. Part of me still searched for an innocent explanation. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Evan and Melissa hadn't coordinated times. Maybe I was overthinking because of an unpleasant evening. But those maybes began to fall apart when I remembered another detail, the reservation name. I remembered clearly when the hostess asked, I had answered automatically, Bennett. She smiled politely, then shook her head. Only when I added Monroe did her eyes light up, and she led me straight to the private room in the back. That dinner wasn't under my son's name. It was under Melissa's parents. Evan hadn't been the host. He was just a guest, like me. Except he knew exactly when to arrive. I closed my eyes and let old memories surface, one by one, like pieces of rotten wood floating up after a long rain. Last year's Thanksgiving. Melissa called me that morning, her voice sweet, apologizing for forgetting to mention earlier that they were eating with her parents this year. You can still come if you want, but it's kind of last minute. I said it was fine, wished them a good meal, then went to the grocery store and bought a small turkey to roast for myself, the Christmas before that. Evan sent a very short text. We're traveling with Melissa's family this year. I'll call you later. That call never came. My birthday. One text message, a sweater mailed to me, the brand tag still attached, no handwritten card. I had told myself that was life, that children grow up and have their own families, that I shouldn't expect too much. Margaret used to say I made excuses for other people more easily than for myself. I had laughed and told her she worried too much. Now I couldn't laugh at all. The money Evan had borrowed from me also resurfaced in my mind, like numbers written in fading ink that never fully disappeared. $2,000 18 months ago for temporary cash flow issues. $1,500 last spring, urgent car repairs. $1,000 6 months ago, no clear reason, just, Dad, help me this one time. Each time came with a promise. I'll pay you back next month. It was never mentioned again. I hadn't asked, not because I forgot, but because I didn't want to be the kind of father who chased his own child for money. I didn't want to turn affection into accounting. I had thought silence was generosity, but sitting in that room with yellow lamplight on the old wooden desk, I began to understand that my silence wasn't generosity. It was permission. I opened the desk drawer and took out a black notebook. I used to carry it for work, to jot down calculations and small observations I didn't want to forget. It had been a long time since I last opened it. I picked up a pen, paused for a few seconds, then wrote the first line. Restaurant dinner, mismatched time. My hand moved slowly, the handwriting neat as if I were returning to an earlier version of myself, the man who believed every problem could be understood if examined closely enough. I kept writing. Reservation name, Monroe. Thanksgiving, excluded at the last minute. Christmas, no call. Loans, not repaid. Line by line, no emotion, no judgment, just facts. But when I leaned back and looked at the page, a chill ran straight down my spine. These things, taken separately, could be explained. But placed side by side, they formed a shape that was frighteningly familiar. Like a structure slowly having its load-bearing pillars removed, little by little, until it collapsed without anyone noticing the very first moment. I realized I had been gradually pushed to the edge of the family, not by a single hard shove, but by small, steady steps backward. Each time I stayed silent, each time I told myself, it's fine, the boundary widened just a little more. That wasn't random. It felt like a training process, training me to accept, training me not to ask questions, training me to believe my role was to show up when needed and disappear when I wasn't. I closed the notebook and set the pen down. What I felt now was no longer the confusion of that evening at the restaurant, but a heavy clarity. A pattern had emerged so clearly that I could no longer pretend not to see it. And what frightened me most wasn't how long I had been taken advantage of. It was the realization that that dinner was only the beginning. The house gradually sank into quiet as the clock passed 10 p.m. I turned off the light in the study, returned the black notebook to the drawer, and slowly walked toward the bedroom. On the hallway wall, a photo of Margaret from a trip to Lake Erie many years ago was still hanging there. She stood in front of the gray-blue water, her hair gently blown by the wind, her smile small but enough to make anyone feel at ease. I stopped in front of the photo longer than usual. "You trust people too easily," Margaret used to say, not as a reproach, but as a gentle observation. She had a way of speaking that never made you feel attacked, only made you feel like you should think again. I remembered her voice saying it, low and slow, as if she were afraid of breaking something fragile inside me. That sentence became clearer when I recalled an afternoon nearly 8 years ago, not long before Margaret was hospitalized for the last time. It was lightly raining that day. We sat in the kitchen. I was fixing a sagging cabinet door, and she was picking vegetables at the table. Evan and Melissa had stopped by that morning and stayed less than an hour. After they left, the kitchen felt strangely empty. Margaret was the one who spoke first. "That girl, Melissa," she said, her hands steadily picking wilted leaves. "She doesn't look at you the way people look at family." I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because I didn't want the conversation to go any further. "You're overthinking," I replied, tightening a screw. "She's just practical." Margaret looked up and studied me for a long moment. There was no anger, no blame in her eyes, only a quiet concern. "Being practical isn't the problem. she said, "but the way she looks at you, it's like she's evaluating an object, not a person." I remembered setting the screwdriver down and turning to smile at her. "You always worry too much. She's young, ambitious, but she loves Evan. That's enough." Margaret didn't argue. She simply nodded slightly as if acknowledging my answer and went back to picking vegetables. But that night, lying next to me in bed, she spoke again, her voice softer, as if afraid of bothering me. "You have a very good heart, Harold, but kindness without boundaries sometimes isn't a gift." I wrapped my arm around her and kissed her forehead. "I'm fine," I said. "I know what I'm doing." Standing now in the empty hallway, I realized how wrong I had been. Not because Margaret was right, but because I hadn't listened long enough to understand what she was worried about. Images from Evan and Melissa's wedding suddenly came back, so vivid I could almost hear glasses clinking in the reception hall. It had been a large wedding, held at a vineyard in Napa Valley, where the venue alone cost more than the first pickup truck I ever bought when I was young. Margaret had insisted we cover half the expenses. "Our only son," she said. "We have to give him a good start." I agreed without hesitation. During the reception, I clearly remembered standing near the cake table, talking with a few old friends, when I saw Melissa and her mother leaning close together near the wine bar. They were speaking quickly, quietly. Melissa's eyes flicked toward me for a brief moment, then turned away. At the time, I thought it was just normal bridal nerves, but it wasn't just once. Throughout the evening, I noticed that whenever the conversation turned to money, work, or the future, Melissa paid particular attention. She asked me about retirement, about the house I lived in, about projects I had worked on. Each question sounded polite and casual, but there were more of them than necessary. I remembered one moment when Richard Monroe, Melissa's father, raised his glass and said half-jokingly, "Marriage is a long-term investment. The important thing is choosing the right partner." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I thought he was just showing his business-minded way of talking. Margaret didn't laugh. She stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. A small gesture, but one I understood as her way of asking me to pay attention. I turned and saw that her eyes hadn't left Melissa. There was no tension, no anger, just quiet observation. After the wedding, on the drive back to the hotel, Margaret said very little. When I finally asked her what was wrong, she shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "Just remember to take care of yourself." I thought she was simply tired. Now, those fragments of memory fit together, no longer scattered. They felt like small signs along a road I had traveled too quickly, without stopping to read them. I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my shoes, but didn't lie down right away. A feeling rose inside me that was hard to name. Not exactly anger, not entirely sadness. It was like the regret of someone who realizes he missed his last chance to avoid a heavy storm. I had been too naive. I had believed that kindness alone was strong enough to protect me. I had believed that family, just by sharing blood, couldn't harbor the same calculations as the outside world. Margaret had seen it earlier than I had, not because she was suspicious, but because she observed people with a clarity I lacked. I understood then that kindness without boundaries is not a virtue. It's an invitation for those willing to step over the line. That realization didn't make me want to rush to Evan's house, slam my hand on the table and confront him. On the contrary, it made me strangely calm. Margaret used to tell me that hasty reactions often reveal weaknesses. I used to laugh at that, thinking she read too many detective novels. I wasn't laughing anymore. I decided I would no longer look away, but I also wouldn't confront anyone just yet. If what I was seeing was real, then the people on the other side had been preparing for this far longer than I had. And if that was the case, the wisest move for me right now wasn't to flip the table, but to observe. I lay down on the bed, turning my face toward the nightstand where Margaret used to keep her alarm clock. The bottom drawer still held a few scraps of paper she had jotted down, shopping lists, small reminders. I didn't open it. Knowing they were there was enough. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, making a familiar rustling sound. I closed my eyes, but my mind stayed alert. In the darkness, Margaret's voice seemed to echo, not as a reproach, but as a gentle reminder. "Look closely, Harold," she used to say, "before it's too late." This time, I was ready to look. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not because I had slept well, but because I had barely slept at all. All night, scattered images kept linking together in my mind. The restaurant dining room, the black notebook, Melissa's eyes, and Margaret's low voice coming from somewhere far away. When the pale, early light slipped through the bedroom curtains, I knew I couldn't keep sitting still. I needed to see Evan, not to accuse him, not to argue. I just wanted to hear my son speak, to look him straight in the eyes and see whether there was still something there I recognized. I called before leaving. The phone rang 3 times before Evan answered. "Dad?" His voice sounded slightly surprised but quickly returned to normal. "I want to stop by for a bit," I said. "Just to talk." There was a very brief pause, just long enough to be unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. Okay, we're home." I hung up, changed clothes, put on my old windbreaker, and drove to Evan's neighborhood on the east side of the city. It was a newer development, houses so similar that if you didn't remember the number, it was easy to turn into the wrong driveway. Lawns were trimmed perfectly, white fences lined up evenly. Everything looked perfect in a lifeless way. Margaret used to say she didn't like places like that. "They don't have memories," she said. When I parked in front of Evan's house, the door was already open. Melissa stood on the steps as if she had been watching from the window. "Dad, you're here!" she exclaimed, her voice high and bright. She hurried down, opening her arms as if to hug me. I hesitated for half a second, but still let her lightly touch my shoulder. The familiar scent of her perfume lingered, something that always felt out of place in quiet mornings. "Come in," she said, turning to lead the way. "Would you like coffee or tea? You like black tea, don't you?" I paused for a second. I had never told Melissa that I liked black tea. I looked at her, but her smile remained intact, revealing nothing but excessive attentiveness. "No need," I replied. "I won't stay long." In the living room, Evan stood up when he saw me. He was taller than me now, broader shoulders, but his posture seemed withdrawn, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How are you doing, Dad?" Evan asked. "All right," I said. "And you?" He nodded, his eyes flicking briefly toward Melissa before dropping to the floor. Melissa sat down across from me, crossing her legs, her hands clasped neatly on her knee, the posture of a model host. "Did you come by for something?" she asked gently. "If it's about the other night, it was probably just a misunderstanding." I looked straight at Evan. "I want to talk to you," I said. "Just the two of us." Melissa blinked, very quickly. "Oh," she said, then smiled. "Of course, I have a few calls to make anyway. You two talk comfortably." She stood up but didn't go straight into another room. She walked slowly toward the hallway, then stopped at the office door, closing it. But not all the way. A small gap remained. Evan stood still, his hands in his pockets. I motioned for him to go to the garage. He nodded immediately, as if he had been waiting for that suggestion. The garage was colder than the house. The smell of oil, metal, and old wood reminded me of long ago afternoons when Evan was small, sitting on a low bench watching me fix the lawnmower. Back then, he always asked questions, his eyes lighting up whenever I explained something. Now he stood in front of the workbench, rearranging wrenches that were already neatly placed. A pointless motion, I noticed right away. His hands were shaking slightly. "Evan," I said quietly, "about that dinner, did you know ahead of time?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced quickly toward the door leading back into the house, then looked at me. That look made me pause. It wasn't the look of someone caught off guard. It was the look of someone afraid. "Dad," he said, almost whispering, "that doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" I repeated, unable to hide my surprise. "You think it doesn't matter that I was called there just to pay?" Evan pressed his lips together. I noticed that on the workbench, next to a box of screws, his phone lay face down. A tiny red dot blinked near the bottom edge, appearing for a split second, then disappearing. I recognized details like that from my old work. That wasn't a battery indicator. It was a recording light. My heart started beating faster. He was recording. Questions flooded my mind all at once. Recording for what? For whom? Since when? But I didn't ask. I looked at Evan and waited. "Dad, please don't say anything else," he whispered. "Please." A hollow space opened in my chest. Not anger, disappointment. I had prepared myself to be rejected, ignored, even blamed. But I hadn't prepared for this, the fear in my son's voice. "What are you doing, Evan?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Don't you trust me?" He looked up at me, not avoiding my eyes this time. In them was something familiar, something old, a quiet plea for help. "Please trust me," he said quickly. "It's just, now isn't the time." The air in the garage grew thick. I felt like I was standing in front of an invisible wall, not built by Evan, but by circumstances larger than both of us. I didn't say anything else. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "I'm going." Evan exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since I walked in. He followed me back to the door. Melissa was already standing in the living room, her smile returning the moment she saw us. "All done?" she asked. "Did you two have a good talk?" "Fine," I answered briefly. As I opened the door to step outside, Evan followed me. He stopped on the porch, his hand gripping my arm. The unexpected pressure made me turn back. "Dad," he said very softly, "be careful with what you say." Then he let go immediately and went back inside as if he hadn't said anything at all. I stood there for a moment, watching the door close in front of me. A deep sense of loss washed over me, as if I had just lost my son in a way I couldn't understand. I got into my car and drove away, but my hands on the steering wheel were no longer steady. All the way home, that sentence kept repeating in my mind. "Be careful with what you say." That night I lay in bed, restless. I believed I had lost my son, and yet a part of me couldn't let go of that sentence. It didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like a warning, and that was what kept me awake. That morning began very normally. I woke early, made coffee, and stood by the window watching a thin layer of fog settle over the front lawn. I had barely slept the night before, but my body still ran on old habits. Some days, habit is the only thing that keeps a person standing. Around 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. The sound made me freeze. Not because I was surprised, I rarely had visitors, but because of the rhythm. Just once. Short, confident, the kind of ring made by someone who believes they are welcome. I opened the door. Melissa stood there, alone. She wore a light-colored coat, her hair neatly tied back, holding a small paper bag as if she had just stopped by a bakery. On her lips was the perfect smile I had grown so used to. A smile that never asked permission, never hesitated, always appearing exactly when needed. "Hi, Dad," she said gently. "Am I interrupting?" I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. In that moment, the image of Evan in the garage, his worried eyes and the blinking red dot on the phone lying face down, came back vividly. But I showed nothing. "No," I said. "Come in." Melissa stepped inside with the ease of someone familiar with every corner. She hung her coat on the hook, set the paper bag on the kitchen counter, and glanced around as if checking whether anything had changed. I recognized that look, the look of someone assessing space, value, and ownership. "Your house is always so tidy," she said. "Living alone and keeping it like this, you're impressive." I didn't respond. I poured myself a glass of water, then asked, "Would you like something to drink?" "No need," she said quickly. "I'm only stopping by briefly. There are a few things I wanted to discuss with you." We sat down at the dining table. Morning light streamed through the window, falling across the old wooden surface darkened by years. Melissa placed both hands on the table, fingers interlaced, her nails carefully manicured, the posture of someone about to present something important. "Dad," she began slowly, "Evan and I have been thinking a lot about the future, especially your future." I looked up at her. "My future?" "Yes," Melissa nodded. "You know you're not young anymore. Living alone like this, we're honestly very worried." The way she said the word worried was careful. There was no criticism in it, only appropriate concern. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "You have this house," she went on, "managing it on your own, paying taxes, handling repairs. There's a lot to think about. If you were to get sick, or if something sudden happened, things could become very complicated." I nodded lightly as if weighing her words. In truth, I had heard similar arguments at many financial seminars back when I was still working. They weren't wrong. But the issue was never on the surface of the words. Melissa leaned forward slightly. "So," she said, "we've been thinking of a solution, a safer one, a more humane one." She paused for a beat, watching my reaction. When she saw that I was still silent, she continued. "If you add Evan's name and mine to the property deed," she said, her voice soft as velvet, "we can help you manage everything. It's just to be prepared. You'll still live here exactly as you do now. Nothing will change." That sentence had been carefully prepared. I recognized that every word had been chosen deliberately. Be prepared. Nothing will change. Help you. If something were to happen later, she added, we wouldn't have to waste time dealing with complicated legal procedures. It's all for your benefit. I looked straight at her. "And what does Evan think?" Melissa smiled. "Evan completely agrees. He was just worried you might feel bothered, so he asked me to talk to you first." I nodded slightly and ran my hand along the edge of the table. "I need some time to think about it." At that moment, I caught a flash of impatience in Melissa's eyes. Just a flash, very quick, but enough for me to notice. It was like a small crack in a perfect pane of glass. She hit it well, but not flawlessly. "Of course," she said, though her voice was a bit quicker than before. "This is a big decision. Take your time. I just worry that if we wait too long and something happens, it might be too late." The way she emphasized the words, "too late," sent a chill through me. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to reflect. "I'm old," I said slowly. "I'm not very good with paperwork." "That's no problem at all," Melissa replied immediately. "I know some excellent attorneys. Everything can be handled quickly and smoothly. You won't be inconvenienced." Another detail, attorneys. Quickly. I smiled. "Let me think about it some more." She looked at me for a few seconds, then stood up. "Of course, I'm not pressuring you. I just want you to know we're always thinking about you." Melissa put on her coat and picked up the paper bag. Before leaving, she turned back and set the bag on the table. "Oh, I brought you some pastries. Make sure you eat them." When the door closed, the house fell back into silence. I stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway. Only when it disappeared completely did I let out a long, slow breath. I didn't touch the bag of pastries. Instead, I grabbed my keys, put on my coat, and got into the car. I didn't have a specific plan, just a strong impulse. Melissa had just talked about how her parents were worried about the future, about how they had resources and connections. But in my mind, old pieces were starting to shift. I drove in the opposite direction from downtown, toward the area where Richard and Paula Monroe lived. I had been there a few times before on holidays. A large, two-story white house, tall iron gate, neatly trimmed hedges, everything radiated prosperity. I didn't stop directly in front of the gate. I drove past slowly, then turned onto a small road behind the property. There, the fence wasn't as tall as the front. Shrubs had been planted to block the view, but winter had thinned them out considerably. I parked along the curb and stepped out of the car. And then I saw it. A small sign, white with red letters, staked close to the ground, almost hidden behind the hedges. I had to walk closer to read it. Notice of foreclosure. A foreclosure notice. My heart started pounding. I looked around but saw no one. The house remained still, doors shut tight, curtains carefully drawn. From the front, no one would ever see that sign. The luxury I had once seen, parties, trips, talk of investments, suddenly felt hollow. Just a glossy coat of paint covering a house slowly collapsing from the inside. I went back to the car and sat down, my hands resting on the steering wheel without starting the engine. In my mind, Melissa's humane proposal echoed again, now carrying a completely different meaning. It wasn't about protecting me. It was about saving them. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, then opened them and looked straight ahead. At last, everything was clear. It wasn't Evan. It wasn't family affection. My assets were the real target. I drove away from Richard Monroe's neighborhood without turning on the radio. The familiar road suddenly felt foreign, as if I had stepped into another layer of reality. Everything I had once believed to be solid, stability, family, goodwill, now carried a large question mark. I didn't feel panicked. What I felt most clearly was a cold clarity, like the moment before someone makes a decision with no turning back. Instead of heading home, I turned toward Samuel Wright's office. Samuel was Margaret's longtime attorney, not the kind of lawyer you see on television, fast-talking and smiling constantly. He was quiet, gray-haired, early, spoke slowly, and preferred writing notes with a fountain pen instead of typing. Margaret trusted him, and Margaret didn't trust many people. Samuel's office was in an old brick building downtown on the second floor, with no elevator. I had climbed those stairs many times before, back when Margaret was still alive, each visit tied to a different story. Today, each step echoed beneath my feet like a reminder. Some things had been prepared long ago, just waiting for the right moment. Samuel was sitting behind his desk when I knocked. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I saw recognition. Not surprise, not shock, just waiting. "Harold," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I figured it was only a matter of time before you came." That sentence made me pause. "You knew I would?" Samuel gestured for me to sit. "Margaret knew," he replied. "She said that if there ever came a day when you walked into this office with that look in your eyes, it would mean everything had begun." I sat down, my hands resting on my knees. In the small room, the smell of old paper and polished wood reminded me of afternoons when Margaret sat reading files with Samuel, reading and making careful pencil notes. "Begun what?" I asked. Samuel didn't answer right away. He opened a drawer and took out a thick folder, neatly tied with string. On the cover, I immediately recognized Margaret's handwriting. Steady, calm, unhurried. Margaret prepared everything years ago, Samuel said, not because she suspected any one person in particular, but because she understood people. He opened the folder and turned the pages. Inside were notes, small slips of paper Margaret had written by hand, dates clearly marked. I recognized my wife's handwriting instantly, my chest tightening in a familiar way. She set up a special trust, Samuel continued, not to hide assets, but to protect you. Protect me? I repeated, my voice rough. Samuel nodded. This trust has a very specific trigger clause. It only takes effect when there are signs of elder abuse, financial, psychological, or legal. I swallowed hard. The image of the foreclosure notice, Melissa's humane proposal, the blinking red dot on Evan's phone, all of it lined up in my mind like evidence that could no longer be denied. Margaret didn't want you living in fear, Samuel said, but she also didn't want you becoming a victim simply because you're too kind. He slid the folder toward me. She documented a lot. Small observations, seemingly casual remarks, moments when you were put in a position to give without being asked for consent. I flipped through a few pages. Each one was a slice of memory I had once ignored. A note about Melissa's eyes at the wedding. A brief remark about the way Richard Monroe talked about investments and long-term plans. A question Margaret had written down, unanswered. If one day Harold isn't clear-headed enough to say no, who will say it for him? I had to stop, not because I didn't want to read more, but because my hands began to shake. She also thought about Evan, Samuel said more gently. Margaret always thought about Evan. I looked up. Did she know something? Samuel shook his head. Not something specific, but she knew Evan was easily influenced, too trusting, too quick to confuse responsibility with pressure. He pointed to a clause marked with a yellow sticky note. This trust isn't just a wall, it's a door. If Evan stands with you, if he cooperates when the truth comes out, there's still a path to protect him from the worst consequences. I sat frozen. In that moment, I was no longer an old man being cornered by his daughter-in-law. I was a husband realizing that his wife had seen the storm coming long ago and had quietly built a shelter for me, brick by brick. Margaret didn't want revenge, Samuel said. She wanted justice, and if possible, she wanted to save your family from itself. I closed my eyes. The image of Margaret in the kitchen, picking vegetables, worry in her eyes she never fully voiced, everything suddenly became painfully clear. She hadn't been pessimistic. She had been prepared. What do I do? I asked, my voice so low I could barely hear it myself. Samuel looked at me for a long moment. It's not time to strike back yet, he said. If you reveal your hand now, they'll retreat, or worse, change tactics. What you need to do is let them keep believing you don't know anything. I opened my eyes and looked straight at him. You want me to pretend? No, Samuel replied. I want you to observe. Document. Let things unfold a bit longer. When the trust is activated, we'll need evidence that can't be denied. I nodded slowly. Inside me, a new resolve took shape. Quiet, steady, unhurried. Like when I used to stand before a major construction project, knowing that pouring concrete too early would cause everything to crack. I'll do it, I said. Samuel smiled for the first time since I walked in. Margaret would be proud of you. When I left his office, the afternoon was already wearing on. Sunlight slanted between old buildings, casting long bands of light across the sidewalk. I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and felt the cold air fill my lungs. I understood now. I knew what I had to do. But not today. The family gathering took place on a gray Sunday afternoon at Evan and Melissa's house. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not out of eagerness, but because I wanted to observe everything from the very beginning. The house still looked tidy, orderly, always ready to receive important guests. But this time, something felt different, not in the furniture, but in the atmosphere. Melissa opened the door with a wider smile than usual. She wore a light beige dress, simple to the point of seeming carefully calculated. Not flashy, not cold, just enough to appear approachable. The way she leaned aside to let me in, the way her hand rested lightly against my back as if guiding me, everything felt soft. "You're early, Dad," she said cheerfully. "I was worried you might have to wait." "That's fine," I replied, deliberately smiling gently. "I have time." She looked at me, her eyes flicking over me quickly, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. In the living room, Richard and Diane Monroe were already seated. Richard stood to greet me, but his handshake lacked the firmness it once had. Gone was the confident grip of a man who used to boast about major deals. Diane stepped forward to hug me briefly, quickly. The perfume she wore was cheaper than what she usually used. I took note of everything. We sat around the dining table, the mood held at an awkward level of forced friendliness. I took the initiative to ask about health, work, small, everyday matters. I nodded more than I spoke. I smiled when appropriate. I didn't challenge anything, even when Richard began complaining about difficult markets and unreasonably delayed investments. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "sometimes you do everything right and still have bad luck." "I understand," I replied immediately, showing no hint of doubt. "That's life." Melissa watched me more closely. Evan sat across from me, his hands resting on his thighs, his shoulders tense. He barely joined the conversation, only nodding occasionally or offering a short response when addressed directly. His eyes avoided mine, but every time I smiled gently or spoke in a soft tone, I saw his shoulders relax a little, as if he were exhaling. The meal moved along slowly. Richard drank more than usual. Then Diane kept mentioning rising costs, from insurance to roof repairs. Melissa skillfully steered the conversation back to family, the future, and long-term stability. "You know," she said lightly, "we just want everything to be neatly arranged, especially since you're not young anymore." That statement was framed as concern, but I could clearly hear the assumption behind it, that I wouldn't object. "We think about you a lot," Melissa continued. "Your house, it's large, but if something were to happen later, the paperwork could get very complicated. Adding our names would make things easier for everyone." She said "our" as if Evan and she were a single unit. Evan said nothing. I glanced at him and saw his jaw tighten, then relax. I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "That makes sense." I saw the change immediately. Richard lifted his head, his eyes brighter. Diane stopped smoothing her napkin. Melissa smiled, this time unable to hide a trace of satisfaction. Not joy, but the relief of someone who believes she has moved one step closer. I kept playing my role. I asked Melissa about renovation plans, as if it were a shared family matter. I asked Richard whether he needed any help with bank paperwork, speaking as if it were just casual conversation. I didn't promise anything, but I didn't refuse either. I left everything hanging, just enough for them to fill in the gaps with their own hope. Melissa began talking about my assets in a way that made me work hard not to frown. "If later on we lease part of the land behind the house," she said, turning to Diane, "that could create a steady source of income. Harold's land is in a very good location." Not Dad's land, but Harold's land. That choice of words, unconscious yet clear, showed she had already started treating those things as part of her plan. Evan remained silent. This time, though, I saw his hand tremble slightly as he held his glass of water. He didn't look at anyone, only down at the tabletop, as if afraid that a single glance might force him to choose sides on the spot. I leaned back in my chair and smiled gently. "Those things, we'll figure them out slowly," I said. "I don't really understand this stuff anyway." That sentence was like a signal. Melissa leaned toward me, her voice lower, more intimate. "That's okay, Dad. We can handle it." They grew more confident with each passing minute. Richard talked more, no longer beating around the bush. Diane began asking about accounts, very casually. Melissa stopped hiding her initiative altogether. She spoke as if it were only a matter of time. And I listened. I noted how Richard avoided direct eye contact when talking about the bank. I noted the impatience in Diane's eyes whenever the conversation touched on money. I noted the way Melissa glanced at Evan whenever I appeared agreeable, like a silent reminder. "See, you were worried for nothing." The biggest mistake a predator makes is believing the prey has already fallen. I knew that, and I knew that was exactly what they were thinking. When the gathering ended, Melissa walked me to the door, her hand resting lightly on my arm longer than necessary. "Get some rest, Dad," she said. "Those other things, we'll talk them through slowly." I nodded. "Yeah, thank you." On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence surround me, letting each detail settle into its proper place in my mind. There was no surge of anger, only a growing certainty. The trap had been set long ago, and now, as they believed I had obediently stepped inside it, they had no idea that their confidence was pulling the final cord closed around them. That night came very slowly. I turned off all the lights in the house, leaving only a small table lamp on in the living room, its weak yellow glow falling on the wall where Margaret's photo hung. I didn't read. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees behind the house and the steady ticking of the wall clock, like the heartbeat of an old man trying to stay calm. Just before 11 p.m., headlights swept across the living room window. I didn't jump up. Somehow, I had known this moment would come. When the engine shut off, when the car door closed a bit too forcefully, only then did I stand and walk slowly to the front door. Evan stood there under the porch light. He wore a thin jacket, unbuttoned, his hair messy, his face so tense he looked older than his years. When he saw me, he didn't smile or greet me the way he usually did. He just stood there, as if afraid that if he moved, something would collapse. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I came so late." "Come in," I replied, opening the door wider. "It's cold." He stepped inside, glancing around quickly, as if checking whether anyone else was there. When I closed the door, the sound of the lock seemed louder than usual. Evan stood in the middle of the living room, his hands in his jacket pockets, unsure where to begin. We were silent for a few seconds. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the heavy kind, loaded with too many unspoken things. "I can't stay long," Evan said at last. "Melissa thinks I'm at a friend's place." I nodded and gestured for him to sit on the sofa. I sat across from him. The table lamp lit his face, revealing the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion I had seen but never dared to name. "Tell me," I said, calmer than I expected. "What's going on?" Evan lowered his head, his hands clenched together. When he looked up, I saw not avoidance in his eyes, but a trembling resolve. "I've been recording Melissa," he said. "Not recently, for months." The words didn't surprise me, but they still tightened my chest, as if an invisible wire had been pulled taut. "Recording what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Everything," Evan replied. "Conversations with me, with her parents, the times she talked about you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. Looking at it in his palm, it seemed pitifully small, and yet it held an entire storm. "I started doing it after the restaurant dinner," Evan continued, his voice shaking slightly. "That night after you left, Melissa, She wasn't happy, not because you arrived late, but because you didn't react. I frowned. Evan took a deep breath as if needing more air to go on. She told her mother that you were easier than expected, Evan said, that you just needed to be guided the right way, that the next step had to come sooner. I closed my eyes for a moment, not from shock, from pain, a dull, spreading pain, not sharp, but relentless. "What's the next step?" I asked. Evan looked straight at me. "Guardianship," he said. "They want to apply for legal guardianship, declare you incapable of making your own decisions." The room seemed to shrink. The ticking of the clock suddenly sounded unbearably loud. "How long have they been talking about this?" I asked. "At least 3 months," Evan replied. "Maybe longer. I only know for sure since I found some papers in Melissa's drawer. Templates, medical forms, things that you never signed." I opened my eyes and studied Evan closely. "You saw forged documents?" Evan nodded. "They have your signature, but it's not your signature." I said nothing. Evan placed the USB drive on the coffee table between us, like evidence in an invisible courtroom. "Everything is on there," he said. "Recordings, messages, photos of documents, even conversations that I wish I had never heard." He paused and swallowed hard. I didn't know what else to do except stay silent. If I objected, if I sided with you too early, she would delete everything, or change the plan. I looked at my son, who had sat silently for months, enduring my looks, my unspoken suspicion, just to keep everything from blowing up too soon. "So I let them think I was on their side," Evan said. "I let them believe I chose them." His voice broke on the last word. I stood up, walked over, and sat beside Evan, placing my hand on his shoulder. His shoulder trembled under my hand, like a final rope being loosened. "You never betrayed me," Evan said, as if he needed to hear it spoken aloud. "I know," I replied, and this time I truly did. A wave of relief washed over me, fast and unexpected, so strong I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. And then came the pain. Pain that my son had carried this alone. Pain that I had, even for a moment, believed I had lost him. We sat there for a long time without saying anything more. Just a father and son, in a house that had once been a home, now serving as a temporary shelter before the storm. "We need one more move," Evan said finally, his voice steadier now. "What I have is enough to protect ourselves, but not enough to end it." I nodded. "I know." Evan looked up, and there was a different light in his eyes from when he first arrived. "Melissa is losing patience," he said. "She thinks you've completely softened. She'll expose herself." I glanced at Margaret's photo on the wall. In the dim light, her smile seemed to carry that familiar calm. "Then we'll let her do it," I said quietly, "in her own way." Evan nodded. For the first time in months, I saw my son let out a deep breath, as if he had finally returned to where he belonged. The trap had already been set. Now it was only a matter of waiting for someone to step into it. The morning the petition was filed, I was watering the plants on the porch. The sky was clear, the breeze light, sunlight falling across the lawn in a way that felt strangely peaceful. I remember that moment clearly because it stood in complete contrast to the contents of the letter the mail carrier handed me a few minutes later. A petition for guardianship. Melissa Bennett, as my daughter-in-law, for the safety and best interests of Harold Bennett, requested that the court consider appointing a legal guardian due to signs of cognitive decline, inconsistent financial decision-making, and a tendency to isolate from family. I read slowly. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to be sure every word was exactly where it belonged. The language was careful, gentle, concerned, but beneath it lay a sentence that had already been written. I folded the petition, set it on the kitchen table, and poured myself a cup of coffee. My hands didn't shake. My heart beat steadily, because I knew this moment was coming, and Margaret had known it too. Just 2 hours later, my phone rang. Samuel Wright. "The clause has been triggered," he said the moment I answered. No greeting. The instant the guardianship petition was filed, the trust entered protective mode. I looked around my familiar kitchen where Margaret used to stand every morning. Meaning? Meaning all assets in your name, house, land, accounts, investments, are temporarily frozen, Samuel said. No transfers, no liens, no changes in ownership, no one can touch them, not even you. I smiled. That's good. Samuel paused briefly. You should still attend the family meeting they requested. I know. And this time, he said slowly, I'll be going with you. The meeting took place that evening at Evan's house. Melissa called me beforehand, her voice appropriately worried, saying that everyone just wanted to talk things through, that legal matters sound scary but are really just procedures. I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, everyone was already there. Richard Monroe paced the living room, his tie crooked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool weather. Diane sat in a chair, her hands tightly clasped, lips pressed together. Evan stood near the window, his back straight but rigid as wood. Melissa sat in the center of the room, her composure strained but intact. They did not expect me to arrive with Samuel. When I stepped in and Samuel followed, briefcase in hand, his gaze sharp and quiet, no one greeted him. No one seemed to know what to say. Dad, Melissa stood first, her smile delayed by half a beat. I didn't know you were bringing a lawyer. I wasn't consulted when you filed the petition, I replied calmly. So I didn't think I needed to ask. Samuel set his briefcase on the coffee table, opened it, and took out a thick stack of papers, laying them out neatly. We can begin, he said in a neutral tone, since everyone's time seems to be very urgent. Melissa sat back down. I could clearly see her hands clenching until her fingernails turned white. Samuel didn't waste time. The guardianship petition you filed this morning, he said, has activated the protective clause in the trust established by Mrs. Margaret Bennett prior to her passing. Diane's head snapped up. What trust? An elder protection trust, Samuel replied, with a very clear trigger condition. Any legal action intended to strip Mr. Harold Bennett of his right to self-determination without an independent medical ruling. Richard let out a short, dry laugh. You're making it sound like we did something wrong. Samuel looked straight at him. We're about to discuss that. He flipped to the first page. As of this moment, all of Mr. Bennett's assets have been frozen. No one can access them. Including family. Melissa jumped to her feet. That's not legal. Samuel didn't look up. It is legal. It has been reviewed by 3 independent law firms, and it was signed while Mrs. Margaret was fully competent, with a medical evaluation attached. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Richard began breathing rapidly. Diane pressed a hand to her chest. Melissa turned sharply toward Evan, her eyes like knives. Evan, she said, did you know about this? Evan didn't answer right away. Then he stepped forward and stood beside me. Yes, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. I knew. Melissa froze. You... And I know more than that, Evan continued. He pulled the black USB drive from his pocket. On this, Evan said, are recordings from the past 6 months. Richard stepped back half a pace. Recordings of what? Conversations about the plan to file for guardianship, Evan said. Discussions about selling my father's house after stripping him of his rights, and forged documents with fake signatures. Melissa screamed. You betrayed me? Evan looked straight at her. No, I protected my father. Samuel took the USB and plugged it into the tablet he had brought with him. He selected a file and pressed play. Melissa's voice filled the room, clear and undeniable. Once the court believes he's unstable, everything will be ours. That old man doesn't even know how much he has. Diane let out a short scream. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Stop it!" Melissa shouted. "That's edited!" Samuel switched to another clip. This time Diane's voice. "We have to move fast. The bank won't wait much longer." Richard staggered. He reached for the chair, his face drained of color. "Richard!" Diane cried out. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only gasped for air. Then he collapsed into the chair, clutching his chest. Everything descended into chaos. Melissa screamed for an ambulance. Diane cried. Evan stood frozen. Samuel called 911 with a calm that bordered on cold. And I just sat there. Not because I felt nothing, but because in that moment I understood the game was over. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with the truth, spoken at the right moment, in front of the right people. When the paramedics took Richard away, Melissa stood alone in the middle of the room, her eyes red, her mask completely shattered. No control left, no calculated smile, just a woman who had lost everything because she believed the prey was already down. Samuel closed the tablet and turned to me. "We'll take it from here," he said. "The guardianship petition will be dismissed, and what remains will be handled by the law." I nodded. Evan stood beside me, his shoulders trembling slightly. I placed a hand on his back. "It's over," I said quietly. And this time, I knew it was true. The days that followed passed like a series of distant sounds I could only partially hear. The phone rang constantly. Letters arrived. Unfamiliar faces appeared and disappeared. I signed papers, answered questions, repeated the same story to people in authority, all in a calm voice that surprised even me. The investigations moved faster than I had expected. They didn't stop with the failed guardianship petition. The recordings, forged documents, and carefully preserved statements on that small USB drive opened doors the Monroe family could no longer close. Banks reviewed records. Old transactions were dragged into the light. Loans once hidden behind a polished image now revealed their desperate reality. Evan moved back in with me temporarily into the house where he had grown up. There were no long conversations right away. We simply coexisted in the same space, each carrying our own fragments. He slept in his old room. At night I heard his footsteps moving quietly through the house, slow and careful, as if afraid of waking memories. One morning, while I was making coffee, Evan placed a stack of papers on the table. "I filed for divorce," he said, his voice even. I looked at the papers, then at my son. There were no tears, no shaking, just a deep, steady exhaustion. "Are you okay?" I asked. Evan shrugged, a gesture I remembered from when he was a boy. "I don't know, but I can't keep living like before." I nodded. No advice was needed. Some decisions don't need approval, only respect. My in-laws' collapse was very ordinary. There were no dramatic scenes, no grand statements, just one piece removed at a time. The house with the white fence and manicured lawn was repossessed by the bank after months of delays. Social invitations disappeared. Calls went unanswered. People who once called Richard Monroe a partner stopped saying his name altogether. Melissa was formally investigated. I wasn't present for the interrogations, but I knew enough to understand that the mask she had worn was completely gone. No more sweet talk about family. No more quiet, measuring glances. Only specific, dry questions, and evidence that couldn't lie. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I had thought I would feel satisfaction, a bit of relief mixed with victory. But I didn't. What lingered longest was fatigue. A very old, very deep fatigue, as if I had walked much farther than I realized and only now felt how heavy my legs were. In the evenings, I sat alone on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. No ringing phone, no letters, just insects and a light breeze. I thought about what had happened, not to analyze it, but to understand what remained. Revenge, I realized, doesn't bring peace. It may bring brief satisfaction to the young. But for me, at this age, it leaves only emptiness. The emptiness of lost years. The emptiness of trust given too easily. Justice is different. Justice doesn't cheer. It doesn't applaud. It quietly returns things to where they belong. And in that silence, I felt a very specific kind of peace. Slow, understated, but real. One afternoon, Ijeng Li ed Margaret's study, not to pack it away, but to set it in order. I found her old notebooks, notes about books, scattered ideas, things she wanted to do when there was time. One page was folded over. On it was a single line, written very small. Protection is not control. It's allowing someone to live as themselves. I sat there for a long time, my hand resting on the yellowed page. For the first time since everything happened, I didn't feel weighed down when I thought about the future. A new path opened, not because I had won, but because I was no longer bound by what had been. I didn't know where that path would lead. Maybe quieter mornings, maybe slower conversations with Evan, maybe very small, very ordinary things. But this time, I would walk it with my eyes open and with my own boundaries. Evan stayed at my house longer than we originally expected. At first, it was only supposed to be a few weeks, to get settled, as he put it. But weeks turned into months, and neither of us felt the need to name it. Each morning, I got up early to make coffee. Evan usually appeared later, hair still messy, eyes not fully awake. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, not needing many words, just knowing the other was there. Some mornings were peaceful, others were heavy, when the truth had nothing left to soften it. One evening, as rain tapped against the porch roof, Evan sat on the sofa, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. I saw his shoulders tighten, as if preparing to say something difficult. "Dad," he said hoarsely, "there were moments when I thought I'd really lost you." I didn't answer right away. I moved closer and sat in the chair across from him, leaving the space between us close but not forced. "I thought you saw me as a traitor," Evan continued. "I could see it in your eyes, and I didn't know what else to do but stay silent." I nodded slowly. "I did think that," I said, "for a very brief moment, and I regret it." Evan lowered his head. Drops fell from his hair into the cup. I didn't know whether it was rain or tears, and I didn't ask. Some questions only make things hurt more. "I couldn't protect you directly," Evan said. "All I could do was endure quietly. And sometimes, I hated myself for that." "You protected me in the only way you could at the time," I replied. "And I didn't see it soon enough." We sat there for a long time, not trying to wrap the conversation up. The truth, once spoken, doesn't need to be fixed immediately. It only needs to be acknowledged. A few days later, Evan told me he had contacted a therapist, not because anyone told him to, but because he realized there were things inside him that had been held down for too long. "I don't want to carry what happened into the next part of my life," he said. "I don't want to become someone who always lives on defense." I looked at my son, a grown man learning to face his own wounds, and felt a quiet pride. "I'll be here," I said. "Not to control you, just so you know you're not alone." One afternoon, when Evan came home late from therapy, I went into Margaret's study. I had organized it many times, but that day I opened a drawer I had never touched before. Inside was an ivory-colored envelope, sealed with just 2 words written on it. Evan. Margaret's handwriting. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, as if afraid that doing so would permanently change something. But then I understood. Some things only become right when everything else has fallen apart. That evening, I called Evan to the table. He froze when he saw the envelope in my hand. "Mom's?" he asked. I nodded. "She wrote this for you a long time ago. I think now is the time." Evan opened the letter, but after reading just a few lines, he stopped. His hands began to shake. "Can you read it for me?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath and began to read slowly, one word at a time. Margaret wrote that she saw Evan as a good person, but one who too easily carried other people's burdens on his shoulders. She wrote that love is not silent endurance, and that protecting family does not mean sacrificing oneself. She apologized for not having said enough while she was alive, and she left Evan with one final reminder. If you ever have to choose between pleasing others and keeping yourself, choose yourself. When I finished, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Evan raised a hand to his face, his shoulders shaking. I said nothing. I just sat there and let the pain move through at its own pace. Forgiveness came very slowly, not as a grand declaration, not as a dramatic embrace. It arrived in small moments, when I stopped blaming Evan for what he hadn't done, when Evan stopped punishing himself for what he couldn't change. Our family did not return to what it once was, and maybe it never should. But it became more honest. I learned to set boundaries, even with my son. I didn't ask about every detail of Evan's private life. I didn't interfere with decisions he needed to make himself. I allowed myself to say no without guilt. Evan learned to take responsibility for his emotions and his choices. He stopped apologizing for things that weren't his fault. He learned to state his needs clearly, even when it made others uncomfortable. One morning, as we were cleaning up the backyard together, Evan looked up at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "Dad," he said, "I think we're doing better." I smiled. "Yeah, little by little." We didn't start over from zero. We started over from the truth. And this time, that was enough. Spring arrived late that year. New buds appeared later than usual, as if the garden itself needed more time to believe the storm had truly passed. I spent many mornings in the backyard, hands in the dirt, repairing the old fence, planting a few flowers Margaret had loved, not to make things new, but to return them to a steady rhythm. In those quiet moments, I thought a lot about what had happened, not with regret, but with the calm of someone finally able to look back on the entire journey. Margaret had left me more than I ever understood, not just a trust or carefully prepared documents. She left me a way of seeing, a gentle clarity, a belief that love doesn't mean closing your eyes, and that kindness should never require erasing yourself. That thought stayed with me for weeks, until one afternoon, as I sat in her old office, sunlight slanting through the window and touching the worn edge of her wooden desk. I reopened Margaret's notes, not to look for evidence but to find the next direction. And then I understood. If Margaret had prepared to protect one person, I could do the same for others. The fund to support seniors facing financial abuse was created quietly. No launch event, no press. Just a clean legal file, a small group of people who knew what they were doing, and one clear goal: legal support, guidance, and connection for older adults being manipulated within their own families. Not everyone is beaten. Not everyone is threatened. Most are worn down slowly, by sweet words, by excessive concern, by decisions made for your own good without ever asking what you want. I met some of them, older men and women sitting across from me with eyes so familiar it hurt. The eyes of people who believed silence kept the peace, that giving in preserved family, that suspicion was something to be ashamed of. I didn't offer cliches, I told them my story. slowly enough for them to see themselves in it. And I told them what I wish someone had told me sooner. You are not weak for setting boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting yourself. And you are not alone. The story you've just heard, my story, is a created story. But it's built from very real truths. It is not meant to spread hatred, attack any individual or organization, or encourage revenge. It exists to remind us of boundaries, awareness, and the courage it takes to recognize when something is wrong, even when it comes from those closest to us. If you've made it this far and feel a heaviness in your chest, it may be because you're in a situation like the one I was in, or because you're worried about someone you love, or simply because you recognize signs you once ignored. Whatever the reason, I want you to know this. Silence is not the only option. There are slower, safer, and kinder paths out of control. I'm grateful you took the time to listen to this story all the way through. At this stage of life, time is the most valuable thing we have. The fact that you stayed, listened, and reflected means more than you might think. If you'd like, tell me where you're watching from. Do you think the narrator did the right thing? If this story resonated with you, leave a comment, press like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the stories to come. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for not turning away from stories that need to be told.